Welcome back. We are excited that our store is opened again. We're excited to see our customers again, and we have found that one of the things that so many people are asking for now is that they've finished projects. So they're ready to bind their quilts, and that's always been a part that hasn't been fun or interesting, and lots of times quilts will just sit and wait to be bound. It's so simple. I'm the official binder in the store, so with that job I have one evening to bind a quilt, and that's the max I can give it. So I'm going to bind it by machine. They are machine pieced, they are machine quilted, they're going to be machine bound. So I see a lot of people as they wander through the store, they come take a little peek at the back side, and they always want to know how mine always look. The stitching is up on the binding, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to get that stitching so it looks like it's been put on with a bias binder. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I did this little sample, and in my best suggestions for your binding are, first of all, to use a busy little fabric for the binding. Your stitches or any inaccuracies don't show up nearly as much. My second suggestion is that you use a fine thread, not a big old heavy fat thread to do it, because you want your thread to just blend in. My suggestions for that are, of course, Aurifil or DMC. And then when you turn it over to the back, you can see that I have stitching that shows on the front and on the back, and it looks just the same. So let me show you what I see a lot of people bringing their bindings in, and this is the complaint. If this is the binding, and I just did this little practice one, and I have the top, and both look good. Both look good from the top, but when I turn it over to the back, one has the stitching directly on the binding, and the other one, the stitching is out here on the quilt. So this seems to be the issue that doesn't make people happy. They want it to look the same on the back as it looks on the front. So it's all about how wide you cut your binding and how wide you sew it on. So I've got a little formula right here, so you don't have to try to be taking notes, that we stitched out, and what we're talking about today is double binding. Not a single binding, not a bias binding, but a double binding. So the strips are going to be cut on the fold, going to be cut cross grain, and they're going to be folded in half. So the first thing you have to decide on is how wide do you intend to sew the binding on. If you intend to sew it on with a quarter of an inch, a quarter of an inch, excuse me, like 3/8 or 1/2 of an inch. Any of those are your possibilities. But once you determine that, you need to stick with that amount. So my general idea is I sew mine on with 3/8 of an inch. If I don't have piecing coming all the way out, if I have piecing coming all the way out and no border, I need to bind with a quarter of an inch so I don't cut my points off. But my preferred binding is 3/8 of an inch. If you use 3/8 of an inch, it equals 2 1/4, plus your quarter for the batting is 2 1/2, and this is definitely my preferred one. Some people want a big, bold, wide binding, and you can sew it on easily with a 1/2 inch. 6 times 1/2 equals 3, plus a quarter is 3 1/4. So once you have the width that you're going to cut your strips, you must stick with that when you're sewing it on, okay? So now let's take a look at piecing our strips together. Let me get Now I've got this turned, so hopefully you'll be able to see it. And when the strips go together, we want to piece them on a bias seam. You don't have to worry about the edges. You just put them perpendicular underneath your sewing machine so that they are straight to each other, and you sew from upper left to lower right. And remember that, because we're going to use that later, upper left to lower right, so that you get a straight seam. Almost everyone is familiar with this type of piecing for the binding. So when my binding strip is then stitched, this was my first one that you can see where I sewed him. And then my second one, I trimmed it and then finger pressed it open and then this is the seam that I'm working with. So my binding strip looks like this. Now, this is where a lot of people will take it to the ironing, start ironing it down. I eliminate that step completely. Probably saves me 20-30 minutes, easy. But if you're pressing this down and pressing a hard crease into it, you have established a turn line, and with it soft, it's going to turn a lot easier for you. So you're just going to eliminate the ironing. Like I say, we already saved 20 minutes. All right, now I'm going to show you how to stitch this on. And I cut my strip 2.5 inches, so that means I'm going to sew it on with a 3/8 inch seam. And I need to be able to get that seam allowance on my sewing machine. So I'm often asked, how do you do that? They're all different, so the simplest way is to just take a piece of typing paper, mark 3/8 of an inch on there, put the edge of your foot, and move your needle over until it hits that line to give you a 3/8 inch. If you're lucky enough to have a machine that is able to save that for you, you just put it in a memory and you can use that every time you're ready to do a binding. So when you start sewing, you're going to stitch your binding to the back side. If you are doing your binding by machine, we sew it to the back and we finish it on the front. If you choose to use the same method, but you want to do it by hand at the last step, you sew it to the front and you hand stitch on the back. But we're going to stitch it to the front because we only have one evening to finish this. So once I start sewing, I start anywhere except the corner, anywhere in one of the long edges. I need a nice long 10-inch tail or so before I start sewing, and then when I stitch, I sew with my 3/8 inch seam and I end my stitching 3/8 of an inch from the edge that I'm going to turn to. If I was using a quarter, I would end a quarter. If I was using a half, I would end a half. So whatever my chosen seam allowance is that I'm sewing on, that is going to be how far I stop. And once I get to stitching, then I take it back stitch and take it out of the machine. I take my strip, I fold it back, and instead of saying fold back a 45-degree angle, which can always be confusing, if you just have the raw edges even, you will get that 45-degree angle. And see how these edges line up right straight? That's because I stopped at the right place. And then I'm ready to fold again, and I start to stitch again. This time my stitching will start all the way at the end, back to my 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I go to the next turn. I'm going to pick up another sample and show you the second turn. So this sample, I made my first turn successfully and I started again. So this time I'm sewing down my same seam allowance and I stop and back stitch. When I take it out of my machine and I turn it back, you can see right here this jag. I didn't come far enough down. I missed it a stitch or two, so this is not going to give me a satisfactory corner when I'm finished. So I would need to put it back into my sewing machine, come down a stitch or two, back stitch, so that when it does turn, it will be even. So I'm going to continue on the next step, the next step, the next corner, and finish all the way around to the corner. Now you've made it all the way around your quilt and you're ready to finish. We want to leave us plenty of area to finish, so you quit sewing about 10 to 12 inches from where you started. So I'm going to bring up now my big board so that you can see some bigger samples and have some directions as to exactly how I did this. So this is where we've ended. This right here, when I bring this in, I fold one edge back, fold the next edge back, and I leave maybe a 1/16 of an inch. Don't bump them up together. You would rather be able to stretch this binding a little bit than to have it buckle at the end. So I'm leaving about a 1/16 of an inch. Then I've just clipped both edges with my scissors. You want to be sure you clip at the fold. Don't allow those scissors to roll because you can increase the length that way. So be sure you're clipping at the fold, okay? Now we're going to just do a little bit of turning and these clips. So As you have the binding facing you, the strips are facing you, you're going to take the strip that's on your left-hand side, and that strip you're going to open up so you've exposed the wrong side. You can see I have my little clips, but I didn't know if it'd be easier for you to see also, so I put marks where you could actually see. So you open your strip up to expose the wrong side, and then you turn your strip up to expose the right side. And it's critical that you turn it up. You open it up and you turn it up. So now I can see where my two clips are, and my little extra line is there to visually make it simpler. The strip on the right-hand side, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to bring it right sides together over my other strip. It's going to be perpendicular, a perpendicular seam, just like we sewed the very first one. So it's easy for me to see the two clips. And I'm going to bring those clips up. It'll just have a little fold in your quilt to bring those two clips together. So the clip that's down here is going to help me keep this perpendicular. So I can bring it down, and then I can put a pin in it. So when yours is done, it's going to look a straight edge. I'm going to turn this around so I can do it better, so you'll be able to see, and then I'll flip it right back. So I'm going to turn it up and match those pins. And then I'm going to turn it, because I want those to be exactly right. And I pin along the edge. And then now, once I have that pinned, the other side where there's a clip, now I'm going to turn it back around so you can see what you did. So I brought it up, I brought it over, I've pinned parallel to the edge. There's a clip and there's a clip, and it's important that those clips match. Don't have one high and one low. And then keeping your strip straight, there's another clip that matches the top, and then on this edge there's a clip that matches the bottom. So once you get this underneath your sewing machine, it can be a little confusing about which way to sew. So if you just remember, you're going to sew from 2 clips to no clips. You're going to come right down here and stitch 2 clips to no clips. And if your quilt is bulky, you can just take it up, put a pin in it so it makes it easier to do. If you find that it's too tight, rip some of your stitching out to give you more space. All right, when you get ready to sew, if you just remember to sew from the side that has 2 clips that match, down diagonally to the intersection that has no clips. You'll be right every time. So once you get that stitched, I'm going to pull one up that I've already stitched. There's my stitching, and often before I trim my seam, I just lay it back out to make sure it's going to fit. And once I'm satisfied that I have stitched it in the right direction and it's going to fit, I can come back in and just trim this to 1/4 of an inch and finger press it open. So now I have my binding all the way down and all the way around. So what I'm ready to do now is turn my project over to the top and start sewing. So when I stitch now, I've just done a few corners so that you can see. And when you're sewing this, again, I don't use any pins. It's not loaded with pins and it's not loaded with clips. But when I'm stitching it, I'm just able to bring my binding right over and sit it right on top of that stitching line. It's covering my thread line. If I pull this up to show you, you would see my little thread line right there. And that's my guideline. So now I have to move my needle on my machine so that I'm about 1/16 of an inch from this edge. So once you get it underneath your machine and get your needle position correct, you're just going to pull it from the back, bring it over, and sew. And you're going to work your way all the way around. At the corners, when you get to your corner, you want to pull the bottom layer up first and then bring the top layer over, so that as you're stitching, you will come with the seam and across. If you do it the other way, you're going to have a lump that's going to catch. So as you get close to the bottom, you just stop, bring the turn side up, and then just bring it over, and you'll see that your little miter just forms right there. And you stitch right down to it, turn, and keep going. And then once you're finished and you turn it over, you have stitching on the binding. And again, I highly recommend you use a busy binding and a thin thread, and it will hide any little errors that you have. I know it's time to bind some of those quilts, so hopefully this has been helpful. We look forward to seeing you back in the store. We are open now. Our hours seem to change on a regular basis, but currently we're open Tuesdays through Fridays, 10 to 2. And we are not only encouraging that you wear a mask, but we're insisting that everyone wear a mask. We all have them on. It's courteous to the next person. And we would hope that you would come see us and enjoy some time in the store. We are only able to accommodate 8 shoppers at this point, but to date it has been very doable. And our best suggestion is if you come after 1. It seems to be a little less busy then. So we hope to see you in the store. If you have any questions on your binding, I'll be glad to talk to you next time I see you. Thanks so much.